The day I found out, I was standing in my best friend's kitchen wearing her spare house key around my wrist like I had 100 times before. That detail still gets me. The casual intimacy of it. How I had let myself in through the back door because she'd asked me to water her plants while she was supposedly at her mother's place for the week. How normal it all felt right up until it didn't. My name is Claire, and I was 31 years old when the life I thought I was living turned out to be something else entirely. Something I had been standing in the middle of without ever seeing the shape of it. I should back up. My husband and I had been together for 6 years, married for 3. We met through my best friend, actually. She introduced us at a birthday party at her apartment in the fall, back when everything between the 3 of us was uncomplicated and easy. He was funny in that dry, quiet way that takes you a minute to catch. I remember thinking he was the kind of person who actually listened when you talked, which felt rare. We dated for almost 2 years before he proposed on a Tuesday night in our kitchen. No fanfare, just the 2 of us and a ring he'd been hiding in a coffee mug on the back shelf. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My best friend was the first person I called. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. We had been close since college, the kind of friendship where you don't really remember life before it. She was the maid of honor at our wedding. She gave a toast that made my mother cry. She kept a photo from that day on her refrigerator for years. The 3 of us standing outside the venue, laughing at something I don't even remember anymore. I'm telling you all of this so you understand what I'm about to tell you. The week she went to her mother's, I had a freelance deadline and a low-grade headache that had been sitting behind my left eye for 3 days. I wasn't thinking about anything except finishing my project and remembering to water her fiddle leaf fig, which she was irrationally attached to. I let myself in on a Wednesday afternoon. The plants were fine. I watered them. I was about to leave. Then I noticed her laptop was open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was going to close it so it wouldn't overheat, which is something she always forgot about. But the screen was on, and what was open wasn't a browser or a document. It was a folder of photos. And the first image I saw before I could look away was my husband. With her. Not in a way you could explain away. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then I sat down on her kitchen floor, still in my coat, and I started to understand that I was going to have to completely rebuild everything I thought I knew. Here's what I found in the next hour, because once I started looking, I couldn't stop. The photos went back almost a year. Not just a few, dozens of them. Weekends away that had been explained to me as work trips. A hotel in Charleston I recognized from a photo he'd sent me of the view from his conference room window. Restaurants I'd never been to. An album labeled with her initials and a small heart. I found a printed email confirmation tucked inside a cookbook on her shelf. A reservation for a lake house rental the following month. 2 weeks. Booked under both their names. I found a jewelry box in her bedroom drawer with a necklace inside I had never seen before, and the card in his handwriting that said, "For the life we're building." I found a notebook where she had written, in her own looping script, a list of apartments in a city 4 hours away, some of them with stars beside them. They were planning to leave, not just to end things with us, to disappear somewhere new together and start over. Quietly. Without a confrontation. Without a conversation, without giving my husband or me the chance to see it coming. I sat on her kitchen floor with my coat still on, and I thought about every single time over the past year that one of them had looked me in the eye. There were a lot of times. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. I think I was too far into shock for them to shake. I took photos of everything on my phone, the printed reservation, the notebook page, several of the photos on her laptop screen. I closed the laptop gently, exactly the way I had intended to, and I left the house and locked it behind me and drove to a parking lot 2 blocks away and sat there for 45 minutes. Then I called my older sister. She is 8 years older than me and has the kind of voice that stays level even when everything around her isn't. I told her everything in one long run-on sentence, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay, come here, don't go home yet." I drove to her house. She made coffee neither of us drank. We sat at her kitchen table and I showed her the photos on my phone and watched her face do the thing where she was processing something terrible while trying not to show me how terrible it was. "How long do you think it's been?" she asked. "The photos go back almost a year," I said. "But I don't know when it started." She nodded slowly. "Do you know what you want to do?" I didn't. Not yet. But there was one thing I knew with complete certainty, which was that my husband's company's annual dinner was in 4 days. It was a big deal. His firm had been planning it for months. Formal event at a downtown venue, spouses invited, the whole thing. He had reminded me about it twice that week. He had asked me what I was planning to wear. She was going to be there. She worked in an adjacent industry, knew several people at his firm. She'd been to the event before. It had always seemed like a coincidence. Now, it didn't seem like a coincidence at all. My sister watched me work through it. "You're thinking about the dinner," she said. "They're going to be in the same room," I said. "And neither of them knows that I know." She looked at me carefully. "What are you thinking?" I told her. She didn't try to talk me out of it. The next 4 days were the strangest of my life. I went home that night and made dinner and watched television and went to bed. And I lay there listening to my husband breathe beside me, and I thought about all the versions of my life that existed in my head, versus the one that was actually real. I didn't sleep much. I got very good at having a neutral expression. He mentioned the dinner twice more. He seemed relaxed. He kissed me on the cheek on Thursday morning before work and said he was glad we'd get a night out. I smiled and said me too. I called in a favor with a college friend who was a paralegal and asked her to help me understand what I was looking at in terms of financial accounts. We had a joint account, savings, the usual, but I had also noticed in her notebook that one of the apartment listings had a rent amount circled with a question mark and what looked like a calculation beside it. Numbers I didn't recognize. I gave my friend the information I had, and she called me back the next day and told me that there was a separate account in my husband's name that I had never known about, and that it had been accumulating transfers for at least 8 months. Not a catastrophic amount, not hundreds of thousands, but enough. Enough to rent an apartment somewhere new. Enough to leave quietly and sustain a life for a while before I even understood what had happened. That detail made it real in a different way than the photos had. The photos were about feelings. The account was about a plan. On the afternoon of the dinner, I got ready carefully. I wore a dress I'd bought for a different occasion and never had a reason to wear. I did my hair the way I do when I actually want to, not just the usual. My sister texted me, "You have everything you need. Just remember to breathe." He told me I looked beautiful when I came downstairs. He meant it, I think. That's the part that's hard to explain to people, that someone can be doing something like this and still mean it when they say you look beautiful. People want it to be simpler than that. They want the villain to have been a villain all the way through. It's more confusing when they weren't. We drove to the venue together. He pointed out a restaurant we'd been meaning to try. I said it looked good. The whole drive felt like something happening at a slight distance from me, like I was watching it from a step behind. She arrived about 20 minutes after us. I saw her across the room before she saw me. She was wearing green. She looked the same as she always had. She spotted me a few seconds later and her face did a very specific thing. A small recalibration, a fraction of a second of something I'd never noticed before, and then the smile. The warm, easy, practiced smile. She came over and hugged me. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn for years. "You look incredible," she said, which is what she always said. "Thank you," I said. "So do you?" We got drinks. We talked to other people. My husband circulated, the way he does at these things, comfortable in a crowd. I watched them not look at each other too deliberately and understood that this was a skill they had developed. The careful architecture of two people pretending to be barely acquainted. About an hour in, I found the moment I had been waiting for. The firm's managing partner was giving a short speech and everyone had gathered loosely to listen. My husband was to my left. She was a few feet away, near the edge of the group. Several of his colleagues were immediately around us. His boss, a woman I'd always liked, was standing close enough to hear a conversation at normal volume. I didn't make a scene. I want to be clear about that. I didn't raise my voice or cry or throw anything. I simply turned to my husband while the speech was still going and said, quietly and calmly, I went to water her plants on Wednesday. I found the photos. I found the reservation. I found the account. He went very still. I'm not doing this here, he said, just as quietly. I know, I said. But I wanted you to know that I know, and I wanted to tell you somewhere you couldn't just walk out of the room. I turned slightly so I was also addressing the space she was standing in. She had heard. I could see it in the way she'd stopped moving. I also found the notebook, I said, with the apartments. Neither of them said anything. I'll be staying at my sister's, I said to my husband. My lawyer will be in touch next week. I set down my drink on a nearby table. I said goodnight to his boss, who was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I got my coat from the check-in. I walked outside and called a car and stood on the sidewalk in the cold and waited for it, and the strange thing? The thing I couldn't have predicted was that I felt almost calm. Not happy, not fine, but like something that had been pressing against the inside of my chest for 4 days had finally been allowed to move. My sister was awake when I got to her house. She opened the door before I knocked. We sat on her couch and I told her everything, and at some point very late she made toast, which is a thing she does when she doesn't know what else to do, and we ate it. And I finally cried, the real kind, the kind that takes a while to stop. That was 7 months ago. I'm not going to tell you it's been easy, because it hasn't. Divorce is not a clean thing. It's paperwork and logistics, and running into people at the grocery store who look at you like you might break. It's dividing up a life that was supposed to be shared forever and trying to figure out which parts of it were actually yours. It's grief for something that turned out to be different than you thought, which is its own strange kind of loss. My husband and my best friend did not stay together. I found out about 3 months in through someone who knew someone. They'd lasted about 6 weeks after everything collapsed, before whatever they had couldn't survive being in the open. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel something when I heard that. I'm not sure what to call it. Not satisfaction exactly. More like a specific kind of tired acknowledgement that a fantasy is usually easier to maintain than a reality. The financial piece got complicated before it got resolved, but it did get resolved. My paralegal friend connected me with an attorney who was very good and very thorough. The account he'd been transferring money into became part of the proceedings. I didn't recover everything, but I recovered enough. I moved into an apartment on my own for the first time in 6 years. It's a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor with windows that face east and get good light in the mornings. I painted the walls a color I chose by myself. I bought a couch I actually like. Small things, but they add up. The friendship is gone, obviously. That one took longer to grieve than the marriage, which surprised me and then didn't. My husband and I had been drifting for a while. I could see that clearly once I wasn't standing in the middle of it. The friendship felt like something I'd been sure of. It had its own history, its own language, its own specific kind of trust. Losing that was like losing a piece of the story I told about myself. I have other friends. Some of them showed up in ways I didn't expect. People I'd been less close to suddenly became people I talked to regularly. That part was good. That part reminded me that I had built more than I'd realized. I went back to therapy, which I'd stopped a few years earlier when I convinced myself I didn't need it anymore. Turns out I needed it. My therapist has a plant on her windowsill that I've watched grow taller over the past 7 months, which for some reason I find deeply comforting. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that's hard to say without sounding like a greeting card, but that I believe is actually true. The worst moment of this, standing in that kitchen, on that floor in my coat, was also the moment I stopped being lied to. And there's something in that. Something real. Because the alternative was to keep going, to stay inside a life that had been quietly constructed around a version of me that wasn't being told the truth. That life might have lasted another year. Maybe more. I'd been missing things I was telling myself were normal. I trust myself differently now. I notice things I used to talk myself out of. That's not a small change. If you've ever had the ground shift under something you were sure of, a relationship, A friendship? A version of your own story? I think you know that the disorientation doesn't go away overnight. But it does go, not all at once. More like the way a bruise fades, still there when you press on it, then one day not there anymore, and you can't say exactly when it stopped. I'm still figuring out what comes next. I'm not in a hurry. For the first time in a long time, that feels okay. If something in the story felt familiar to you, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And if you're new here, welcome. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Wednesday afternoon. Not in a mystical way, I don't think the universe was sending me a message or that anything was meant to happen. I think choices compound. That's all. Small decisions, made quietly over time, build into something that eventually has weight and consequence, and a shape you can't ignore anymore. My husband made choices. So did my best friend. And for a long time, I made the choice not to look too closely at things that didn't quite add up. The weekends that seemed slightly off, the way a certain topic would get changed just a beat too fast. I'm not blaming myself for that. I think most people do it. When you trust someone, you build an explanation for the things that don't fit. You smooth them over. It feels like generosity, like giving the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's also a way of protecting yourself from something you're not ready to face. What I know now is that I was already sensing something I wasn't naming. That quiet unease had been there longer than I admitted. And there's something important in that. Not guilt, but attention. The intelligence to notice, and eventually, the courage to stop explaining things away. I'm not a person who acts dramatically. I didn't throw anything. I didn't make a speech. I put on a dress and went to a dinner and said what was true in a calm voice, and then I left and called a car and stood on a sidewalk in the cold. That steadiness came from somewhere I didn't know I had. It came from deciding in my sister's kitchen 2 days earlier that I was not going to let this be done to me in the dark. That if it was going to end, it was going to end in the light, where at least I could see it clearly. That's the thing about integrity, your own. I mean, not anyone else's. It doesn't require the other person to have it. It doesn't require a fair situation or a clean outcome. It just requires that you stay honest about what you know and act accordingly, even when it costs you something. And it did cost me. It cost me a marriage and a friendship and a version of my life I had genuinely loved. I'm not pretending those losses are small. But here's what I kept. I kept my own account of what happened. I kept my clarity. I kept the ability to look back at that time and know that I didn't betray anyone, didn't lie to anyone, didn't build anything on someone else's pain. That's not nothing. After a while, it starts to feel like quite a lot. The two of them made decisions that required constant deception of me, of themselves, of everyone around them. And that kind of thing doesn't stay contained. It bleeds into everything. It changes the way you have to live. The careful management of every story, every alibi, every excuse. They didn't get their fresh start. They got each other in the open, which turned out to be a very different thing from what they'd imagined, and it fell apart in weeks. I think that's what happens when something is built entirely on the dismantling of something else. There's no foundation. There's just the wreckage you made, and eventually you're standing in it too. I think about resilience differently now. It's not about bouncing back quickly or pretending you're fine. It's about staying in motion even when you're not fine, making the appointment, signing the document, painting the wall, eating the toast your sister made at midnight because she didn't know what else to do. It's accumulative. One small act of continuing after another, until one morning you wake up and the apartment is yours and the light comes in east-facing windows and you realize you're actually okay, not performing okay. Actually okay. That took time. It's still taking time in some ways. But I'm here, and I'm telling the truth. That's enough for now.